I hope you are all well. I'm just about to read you another ghost story, as my throat seems to be holding up. Let's hope it works. Just finding the story because it's a compilation. Where is it? Christmas game. Yeah, there we are. Can you hear me? Can you hear me? Right, Christmas Game from 1992 by Susan Price. Are you going to be all right? June said. Yes, Mum. David wished she would just go. And you know where I'm going to be. He folded his arms and leaned on the banister, just across the road at number 42. I wrote down the number, didn't I, by the phone? If anything's wrong, just ring or come and fetch me. You don't mind me going, do you? No, Mum. I wish you could come as well. It seems a shame you being stuck here, but they haven't invited any children, so that's... Mum, if they'd invited me, you couldn't go. Who'd stay with Kenny? That's true. She paused a moment and then started up again. I wouldn't go, but... David sighed and tipped back his head, closing his eyes. You're too old, aren't you, to care about Christmas Eve? And Kenny's in bed, and it was so kind of them to ask me. You don't mind, do you? Eyes closed, head leaning against the stair rail, he said, just go. I wonder if I should just go and check on Kenny. She set one foot on the bottom stair, and David's head snapped down. No, you might wake him up, and he's been a pest all day. He's excited, David. It's Christmas Eve, and he's only little. He didn't have to draw in my book. Oh, your teacher'll understand. Don't make such a fuss. David pushed himself away from the banister, turned and went back into the living room. Kenny had drawn bright crayon pictures of Santa Claus and his reindeer across 4 pages of his history book. His teacher would not understand. 4 pages of his exercise book that he couldn't use, and books had to last a whole year. It wasn't even as if he got on well with his history teacher. It would be, you should look after your things better, Rose. Then you wouldn't have to make excuses. His mother, always the same. Kenny was let off no matter what he did. David always had to stop making a fuss. He had work to do, but he couldn't settle to it until he knew his mother was out of the house, and he hadn't heard the front door slam yet. She'd probably gone upstairs to check on darling Kenny. He sat in an armchair by the fire, on the edge of the seat, waiting with gritted teeth for her to get out. Timmy got up from the hearthrug with a grunt, reared up, and put warm, hard paws on David's knees. Without thinking, David's hand went to Timmy's head, but then he pushed the dog away. Timmy wasn't his. He belonged to the next-door neighbours who had gone away to Portugal for Christmas and dumped a snappy little cake hound on the Roses. Mrs. Rose couldn't say no, and David was stuck with having to take the thing for walks. For days now, he'd been resisting the little terrier's wagging tail and white grin. There was no point in getting fond of him. He'd go back to his owners in a few days. He heard the front door slam as his mother left for her party at last, and he grimaced. He was glad for her. She didn't get out much, and she'd been so obviously pleased at being invited that she'd seemed younger than him. She'd come in and shown him how she looked in her best dress, with her face made up and her hair styled, and had blushed and been embarrassed when he'd said she looked nice. He'd been telling the truth when he'd said that he didn't mind at all her going to the party, even though he had to stay at home and do schoolwork. It was just the way she went on and on and on and kept fussing about Kenny that irritated him. Kenny had put out mince pie and a glass of sherry for Santa Claus. He'd hung up his stocking and he'd gone off to bed quite happy after a day of making a nuisance of himself. There'd been no need to check on him half a dozen times. He got up and went back to the table, where his books were spread out. Economics. Who wanted to be doing economics on Christmas Eve? He slumped in his chair and looked across at the tree in the corner, draped with tinsel and hung with globes. The mantelpiece was cluttered with cards, and at the other end of the table stood the sherry and mince pie for Santa Claus, all set out very elegantly. Kenny had used one of his mother's best china plates and one of her best glasses, and it was all standing on an embroidered tray. Still, it didn't seem like Christmas Eve to David, just another day with homework to be done. He picked up his pen and made himself write another sentence in his essay. Then he drank the sherry, ate the mince pie, and made himself look as though some pages of the textbooks. Timmy stretched and sighed on the hearth. David took an hour off to watch television, dragged himself back to his books, and managed to write another paragraph, and then, exhausted, lay on his back on the floor, staring at the Christmas tree until the spangles and brightness blurred in his eyes. The evening crawled by. 9 o'clock, 10 o'clock, 11. His mother still didn't come home. It must be a good party. It was getting on for midnight when the door of the room opened, and he looked up, expecting his mother. Though he hadn't heard her key in the lock, no one came in. But he was looking too high, as the door continued to open. He looked lower down and saw Kenny in his pajamas. "What are you doing out of bed? Santa Claus hasn't been," Kenny said. "There's no presents." It irritated David that Kenny could still believe in Santa. "It isn't morning yet, dope. Go back to sleep." "It is morning. I've been asleep." David got up from the table. "Just because you've been asleep doesn't mean it's morning. Bed." Kenny caught sight of the empty plate and glass, and his mouth and eyes opened wide. "He has been. He ate his pie. I ate it, David said. You've got to get back to bed. Kenny was shocked and outraged. You ate Santa Claus's pie? If you don't go back to bed, Santa Claus won't come here. Oh dear. Look, if I let you put out another pie and another glass, will you go to bed then? Kenny stuck his fingers in his mouth, stared at David, and made an noise, which might have been an agreement. So David went to the kitchen to fetch the tin of mince pies and the bottle of sherry. Kenny left off stroking Timmy and cried, I want to do it, as soon as David came into the room. Okay. David put the tin and the bottle on the table and dragged a chair close. He lifted Kenny up into the chair and opened the tin for him. Carefully, as if it was an enormously difficult and important operation, Kenny took a pie from the tin and placed it at the very centre of the china plate. He sucked the sugar off his fingers. Now the wine, he said. Give me a chance. David replaced the lid on the tin and unscrewed the top of the bottle. Let me help you. Let me help you hold it. He supported the weight of the bottle while Kenny grasped its neck and guided the mouth more or less over the glass. Brown sherry splashed out. Careful, David said, but some sherry splashed on the white tray cloth anyway. Kenny didn't seem to notice and grinned with pride as David put the top back on the bottle. Can I have a pie? If you take it to bed with you, David said. Give me a pie. David tugged the lid off the tin again and allowed Kenny to take a pie. Now, bed. Kenny seated himself on the chair and bit into the pie. I want to stop up and see Santa Claus come. You promised you'd go to bed. Didn't, Kenny said. Mum put you to bed. She'll be mad if she comes home and finds you up. Don't care, Kenny said. Oh, you will. Shan't, Kenny said. He stuffed the last of the pie into his mouth and jumped down from the chair, heading for Timmy on the hearth. Oh no, David said and grabbed him. Let him start playing with the dog and there'll be no getting him to bed. Kenny immediately began to shriek with fury, screams that made David wince. He threw himself down on the carpet, letting his whole weight drag on David's arms. I'll tell Mum, I'll tell Mum, the child cried. Tell her what? It was amazing how heavy Kenny could make himself, and how many arms and legs he seemed to have to kick and punch with. I'll tell her you hit me and were cruel to me, and their mother would probably believe him. David's shoe slipped on the carpet and he fell, banging his elbow hard on the floor. Kenny landed on top of him, and that hurt too. And the dog, Timmy, came dancing around them, barking. David lost his temper. All right, stay up. You'll fall asleep on the floor before I put you to bed. Shan't, said Kenny, all tears gone, and crawled off David and over to the hearth, all smiles and ready to play with Timmy. Kenny's smugness was infuriating. The brat had got his own way again. Stay up until Santa Claus comes, David said. You'll be sorry. You'll wish you hadn't. Shan't, Kenny said. David picked himself up and found himself standing close by the tree. A little figure of Santa Claus with a red coat of cardboard and a white beard of cotton wool hung from the branch. He pulled it from the tree sending a shower of rustling dry needles down to the carpet and jingling the globes together. His anger extended to Santa Claus. He'd always been irritated by that fat old, smirking, red-faced, boozy chimney climber. You think it's Santa Claus who's going to come, don't you? A nice, kind old man with toys in a sack. But it won't be. Oh, no. Who will it be then? Kenny asked. Father Christmas, that's who. Kenny stared at him for a long moment and then looked away and stroked Timmy. Same thing. No, David said. No, not the same thing. That's Santa Claus. He threw the tree ornament down by Kenny and stepped over him and the dog to take the card from the mantelpiece. That's Father Christmas. A picture on the card wasn't the usual bright Christmassy card picture. It showed a gloomy room with a laughing giant seated at its centre on a heap of food. Pies and cakes, Christmas puddings and little barrels. There were dead animals too. Hares, little pigs and pheasants. The giant's bare feet rested among them. In one hand he held up a burning stick, and in the other a large cup from which wine was spilling. His long robe was of dark green, trimmed with white fur. He had a beard, but it was a dark one, and long dark hair fell to his shoulders. His head was crowned by a wreath of green holly leaves and red berries. That's not Father Christmas, Kenny said. Where's his sack? Santa Claus' coat is red, not green, and his beard is white. That shows how little you know, David said. Father Christmas and Santa Claus aren't the same thing. Completely different. Not, Kenny said, but David could see he wasn't sure of himself. After a whole day of the little pest making his life difficult, that was something. Father Christmas came first, David said. Santa Claus is nothing. He was invented for Coca-Cola advert not so long ago, only about 60 years ago. That's a long time, Kenny said. It is to you because you're only 6. Nearly 7. Only 6. So you know nothing. Santa Claus in his red coat and his white beard, that's just an advert. Father Christmas is much older, ever so old. David made his voice as sinister as he could. He was old before people ever heard of Jesus and started having Christmas. Why is he called Father Christmas then? Kenny asked. He wasn't always. He was only called that after people started believing in Jesus and having Christmas. Before that, he was called... He groped into his memory of the newspaper article he'd read the day before. One of those seasonal pieces about Christmas customs called Wotan. He had Kenny's full attention now. Wotan? Wotan, god of the dead. The dead? David said. Dead. Kenny almost choked. He was afraid of ghosts and skeletons and didn't like to talk of the dead. Oh, he has his good side, David paused. He hadn't read the article carefully, and it hadn't made that much sense. He brought good luck to some people, but he wasn't all goody-goody. He was god of the dead. He lived underground with the dead, and at night, at dark of night. Shut up, Kenny said. You shouldn't say things like this. You'll frighten me. Chicken, David said. Listen, at deep dark of night when the wind's howling. I'll tell Mum you frightened me. Oh, like I hit you and was cruel to you too? Wotan comes riding through the dark on his wild steed with his ravening dogs and their eyes glowing like fire. Shut up, Kenny said, trembling into tears, and struck out at him. David caught his little hand and held it. He'd keep it up until the little brat was crying properly, he thought, and then leave off. It'd teach the little pest not to be such a pain. You know what he hunts? You know what Wotan hunts? Ghosts. All the lost souls who died that year, all wailing and sobbing as they run from Wotan and his headless hounds that have flames burning where their heads should be. Kenny was crying out right now, snivelling, his small frame shaking as David held him between his hands. And if you stay up to see Father Christmas come, like a naughty little boy, that's who'll come, the real Father Christmas, Wotan. He'll come looking for souls, for your soul. He won't, will he, David? He won't. He tried to move forward into his brother's arms, looking for comfort, but David pushed him away and stepped away from him, leaving him crying in the middle of the room. David knew he should stop it now, but when he thought of the drawings in his history book and the embarrassment they were going to cause him, of the carefully made model aeroplanes that Kenny had broken, and all the general annoyance that Kenny had given him, he decided that Kenny should suffer a little bit longer. Do you want to go to bed now on your own? He asked. Kenny shook his head, wailing, tears running down his face. Do you want them to stop up and wait for Wotan to come? Again, Kenny sobbed. I'm going to call Wotan, David said. I know a magic spell. I'm going to say it. I'm going to say the spell and make Wotan come here. No, David, don't, David, don't. Kenny ran after him as he darted across the room and took down the red-berried branch of holly from a vase on the mantelpiece. By this holly, David said, spinning to avoid Kenny's clutching hands. King of the wood, evergreen, I summon you, Wotan, Lord of the dead. David! Timmy had begun to leap about them both and bark. David danced over to the decorations on the shelves and took up a sprig of mistletoe. By this mistletoe, white as the midnight moon, white as ghosts, white as corpses, by this holly, red as blood, I summon you, Wotan, hunter of souls. Timmy stopped leaping, sat and howled. A nice touch that David couldn't have timed better. By this tree, by this dead but evergreen tree, Wotan, hunter of souls, lord of the dead, I summon you. Kenny was no longer chasing him. He was sitting on the floor in the middle of the room, sobbing. Wotan, come! Wotan, come! Wotan! David could hardly speak for laughing. The shrillness of Timmy's howls and Kenny's wails made it all seem funnier. It was only when one wail rose high, high, and higher than a dog's howl or a little boy sobbing that he broke off his chanting and his laughing and listened. There was a sound above and besides the sounds of Kenny and Timmy, a keening that was quite mindless, that was afraid and frightening. It made him want to run. Between one blink and another, he found that the lights had gone out. A power failure? And cold, it was so cold. His eyes were looking into the darkness and distance. There were no walls to stop his gaze. That cold was no draught, but the wind blowing out of miles distant, carrying the chill and the rasp of winter. There was the Christmas tree, but beyond it another tree and another. black shapes in the darkness that had suddenly come, and still that sound, that rising and falling shapeless gabbling of fear. "David!" Kenny fell against him, and David clutched at him, finding a small hand holding him tight. "It's all right, Kenny," he heard his own voice choking. "Don't worry, it's all right." They were outside. He grasped that much. There was the sky, black and darkest blue, with icy stars suddenly gleaming between the clouds. There was a dark mass of the land around them, and the cold wind scratching at them, and the sound of the wind in the trees, like sighs, like rain, and above that the sound of crying, of wailing and crying out. David twisted his body and neck, looking for the house. Find the house, get Kenny back inside and lock the door. But there were no houses. He peered into the darkness, seeing only the shaggy blackness of trees. No lights except the flash of stars. No sounds of cars, only the sound of the wind shuddering through the trees, and that wailing. The wailing was louder. Clutching at Kenny, pushing him behind his back, David turned to face it. There was movement against the sky. He saw the wave of arms, a turn of heads, and then he saw them pouring across the sky, and down from it, people running, not looking back, but staring before them and running. Their mouths were open and they wailed, and they had no message, no meaning, no language. It was only terror that made them moan. And behind them came the hunt, the flickering, leaping light that touched the clouds and lit the trees by moments, and came from the flames that were the heads of the sprinting hounds. And then there came the riders, but not on horses. No horse ever carried on its head those towering branches, black against the sky. Stags, the hunt, were mounted on black stags. Clamping Kenny's hand in his, David ran. The little boy trailed out behind him, heavy and dragging. Turning, David heaved him up into his arms, and then tried to run again. There was no sense in it. He could not be here, trying to run with weighted legs and a clogging heart, in this dark cold. But here he was. He had to keep hold of Kenny. Past them went running shapes, moaning and sobbing. None of the runners looked round. None of them cared for anything but to run, and their cries were not cries for help, but cries of misery. We can't be here with them, David thought, but they were there, and the only thing was to run, because of what was behind them. The shrieks on every side were louder, more piercing, more desperate, and the creatures, whoever they were, turned in every direction and struck out against those near them. Twisting his head, David saw a black bolt rising above him, a branching tree seemingly growing from its head, a rolling eye, and above that, riding it, another black shape. And this black shape reached. David squealed and turned from it, and felt his heart swell as he tried to run faster. And then the weight was gone from his arms. Kenny was gone. Flinging his arms wide, he turned again and saw the black shape rearing above him, and suddenly a wavering light showed him Kenny's shape, slung as if dead, slung like a water bottle in a saddle bow. He yelled and reached for Kenny, but the black shape lunged forward and he was gone, and the hunt passed him by, streaming into the darkness after the wailing of its prey. David stood in darkness and falling silence, and then clutched at his head. Feeling madness swelling there, he looked around for safety, but there was none. And where could he go without Kenny? He ran on, stumbling on rough ground, twisting his ankle, bruising and jarring himself as he fell full length, but getting up and running forward again, after the hunt and the fading wails of the hunted. All the sounds of the hunt left him, and he was in darkness, the full dense darkness of the unlit countryside, where no step can be taken in certainty. The only sound was the soughing and sighing of the wind in unseen trees. He stopped and at least knew that he wouldn't fall, but how long could he stand there? Whichever way he turned, there was no light, and everything was so strange. How did he know where it would be light ever again? "What's happened?" he said. He meant to shout it, but was afraid of what might hear, and whispered instead. Struggling on, he fell into thorns and panicked as he fought out at them. Scratching his arms and face, he struck his head on hard branches, tumbled and banged his knees and grazed his hands, and was miserable. But ahead he saw a faint glow in the sky, a firelight glow, warming and fading with the flickering of the flames. Feeling relief and joy, he made towards it, and was dazzled by it, so that he fell and banged himself onto trees more often. Still he got closer and saw fountains of sparks springing up into the darkness, and even felt the warmth blow towards him on the wind. He reached the top of the rise and smelt the wood smoke, heard the crackling of flames as they gnawed, and saw below, in a sheltered hollow, the red and yellow jumping of the fire. Around it were human shapes, moving, shouting, even singing, the huntsman. He made his way around the hollow, keeping at a distance from the fire, and feeling all the colder now he was nearer. He saw the leader of the hunt, enthroned, a big broad man dressed in green. He wore a crown of green and red holly in his hair. His throne was the catch of the hunt, piled high, deers, birds, foxes, hares, and men and women and children. His dogs were gathered around him, the hellhounds, some with heads and gaping toothed mouths, some with no heads and bursting flame. David went down into the hollow and towards the throne of the game. He was afraid. He limped as he went, and felt blood trickling down his legs, and the wind thrashing his disordered hair about his face. The huntsman turned to watch him as he approached. The flaring, wind-blown fire lighting his face. He had only one eye. By the huntsman's foot in a soft heap lay Kenny. David tried to go forward to touch him, but the hound stirred, bristled, and growled. Most of all, he was afraid of the ones with flames for heads. His foot twisted on some unevenness, and he fell, bashing his knees again. The hounds twitched and growled, and the flame heads lunged towards him. He shrank back from the lick of heat, but the hounds looked to their master, and though they'd groaned with eagerness to reach him, and twitched and shifted their haunches, they stayed in place. Kenny's face was turned towards him, lying as David had so often seen him lie on his pillow, but now with his cheek to the cold ground, his lips and chin were stained with darkness, as if he'd been eating chocolate or blackberries. Then David saw that the darkness had pooled on the ground, and when a hound put down its muzzle and licked at it, he knew it was blood. He began to shake and sob. "It doesn't make sense," he said. "It doesn't make sense." Yet the hard ground that had cut his knees was real. The cold he felt clenched around him was real. Something moved in the firelit shadows, and he flinched. It was the huntsman, leaning down from his throne, the holly berries of his crown blazing red as they caught the light of the fire. He spread his hand before David, as if to make him look at it. His broad, thick hand cupped and caressed a small sapling that grew from the ground at the base of his throne. A bare stick, leafless, it was enduring through the winter, waiting for the warm times to come again. David looked from the sapling to this huntsman's face, with one gleaming eye and one sagging lid hanging over the dark socket. When he looked back at the sapling again, he saw the huntsman's hand tighten around it. He pulled, and the sapling came from the ground. The huntsman was strong. His pull broke even that frozen earth, and something was rising from the soil. Dragged by the sapling's roots, David leaned closer and saw that it was a skull. The sapling's roots had crept deep into the empty eye sockets of the skull. "Death is life," said the huntsman. "That is the sense. But he's only little. I didn't mean it. He's my little brother." The huntsman reached down and lifted Kenny by the scruff of the neck, holding him up as a poacher might hold a dead rabbit. Piece of game. "You wish I should take another in his stead?" The huntsman leaned towards David, yellow teeth grinning through the darkness of his beard, his blind sockets seeming to peer at him. "Which other should I take? You?" David trembled where he knelt. No was his only thought, but he knew that if the huntsman held his silence long enough, he would say yes, because it was impossible to give up Kenny. The huntsman was still grinning. "Promise me the life of the first to greet you on your return." My return? The huntsman held Kenny dangling. "A life for a life. In the stead of this child, I shall take the first to greet you on your return. Do you agree? Freely." The first, David's mind groped for meaning and suddenly saw a clear picture. The little dog, Timmy, rushing at him, yapping wildly, as he had every day since he'd been with them. "Yes, I agree, yes." The huntsman stood and dangled Kenny into his arms. David hugged Kenny tightly to him, gladly taking his weight. Kenny was warm and turned his head against David's shoulder, wiping blood on his jumper from nothing worse than a bleeding nose. The huntsman stepped to the fire and took up a burning branch. The light, golden and flaring, fell over his dark hair and scarlet and green crown, filled his empty socket with blackness, turned the folds of his green robe the colour of the leaves of summer. "The first to greet you," he said. David's gaze was stopped short by a wall, and there was the Christmas tree, closed in by the wall of the room. Its plastic icicles shimmered in the electric lamplight. The warmth of the house pressed so closely around him that his chilled flesh felt suddenly as hard as stone. Chilled, he had been cold, and Kenny, straining his arms with his weight, had a bloodied face, and he could feel the soreness of his cut knees, feel water trickling down his back from his wet hair. It was real, and there was a bargain to be kept. Where was the dog? He stooped to lay his sleeping brother on the settee, and he was freeing his arm from beneath the little boy. His mother's voice said, "Hello, where have you been?" David straightened and turned, and no one was behind him. He had been mistaken. He had heard nothing, but the door to the hall was open now, when before it had been closed. And through it came Timmy, with his hair hanging in his eyes, and his little stump of a tail wagging. Feeling stiff-jointed and dazed, David left Kenny sleeping and went into the hall and along the passage into the kitchen. His heart lurched as he saw someone on the move. His sight cleared, and he recognised his mother's back as she lit the gas ring. the soft loose folds of her party frock billowing about her. David couldn't speak. He had heard his mother's voice. His mother had been the first to greet him. She turned and looked at him and smiled. Want a tea or a coffee? David couldn't answer. He watched as his mother spun around to reach the kettle, watched as her loose sleeve brushed through the flames and became flame itself. His mother's first yell was of astonishment rather than fear. The kettle went flying into the sink with a loud ringing clang. She flapped her arm, trying to knock the flames out, and they flared higher up her sleeve and caught her hair. Frozen, David watched his mother beat at her own head, watched the loose dress swirl with a movement and snatch flames for itself. "Help me! Help me!" David ran forward and, astonished by all the heat, fell back a step. He couldn't reach the sink and the water for the flames burning on his mother. And now she was screaming, shattering screams that seemed to hit David like blows and leave him as shaken. A bottle of milk stood on the table. He snatched it up and threw it over his mother. Most of it missed. The burning woman fell away from the sink. David jumped forward and turned on the taps and snatched a large jug from the draining board. But oh God, while the jug was filling, his mother was burning. She'd fallen to the floor and was rolling wildly. As some of the flames went out, David flung the water at her and ran around the table, still carrying the jug. He shoved past something in the doorway. As he reached the phone, he realized that something had been silent, staring. Kenny. He dialed 999. Christmas Day dawned, and David lay hugging Kenny in a strange bed, in a strange room, in a neighbour's house, listening to the wind rising. He thrummed in the roof space. It buffeted the windows. It reached into the house and rattled the cupboard doors, and through it he heard, rising higher, the soughing and sighing of the forest cut down long ago. A sound that could have been rain or distant running. He heard a bang at the window that could have been a blow from a fist, a wail that could have been his mother's voice, and then the keening and mindless, terrifying crying ran before what chased it. Downstairs the telephone rang with the news he knew was coming. There, my darlings, that is the Christmas Game. Yeah, by Susan Price. I truly hope you've enjoyed it. Shall we have another? I am just going to nip next door and make sure that the dryer is finished, and then I will be back to read you another scary tale. Hello, my darlings. Are you ready for another scary tale? Yeah, of course you are. The Hunter's Hall by Gary Kilworth from 1992. There had been a moment when the sky darkened and the snow-covered forest became still. A moment when the shadows merged. The light fled, and there was utter silence. 1 second, the distant church bells had been ringing their Christmas message through the icicles on the trees, and the next, stillness. The hunter had never known such a silence. He imagined it was like being buried deep in snow. Not a single thing over the whole earth moved or made a sound. It struck fear in his heart, a terror which was like a cold shadow itself. Then came the terrible pain in his chest, followed by the sound of the shot. He thought it was funny, feeling the bullet. It hit him first, then hearing the sound of the rifle. But then he remembered that a bullet travelled faster than sound. He had often seen the puff of smoke from the far-off rifle before the sound of the shot reached his ears. The pain in his chest was over with quickly. Lying there in the snow, his body numb, he wanted to say to his fellow hunters, "I know it was an accident, so I don't blame yourselves." But he couldn't open his mouth or move his lips. Then miraculously he felt fine again. He got to his feet, brushed the snow from his hunting jacket, and turned to say to his comrades, "I'm still alive." But he found himself alone. All his companions had gone. Strangely, there were not even any marks in the snow where they had been standing. Nothing. Now he could hear the birds and the animals again, but the distant Christmas bells were still silent. The trees looked the same, but somehow the whole scene had a curious atmosphere. He began to call out, "Hey, where have you all gone? Jan, Albert, Peter, wait for me," because the fear was back with him again. There was no answer, so he began to walk. As he battled through the deep snow, he saw an incredible number of animal tracks on the forest floor. Among others, he recognized hare, deer, and fox. There were also prints which looked like wolf, but he told himself that wolves had not been in this region for at least 100 years, so he decided it must be some sort of dog. Then he came across the tracks of a wild boar. He was absolutely certain about the boar, being an expert on such creatures. The hunter became very excited and unslung his rifle from his shoulder. What a terrific thing it would be to shoot the last wild boar in the forest. He followed the boar's trail until he reached a clearing. As he approached the clearing, he remembered his earlier foolishness. To be afraid of shadows? How ridiculous! Yet the memory of that terrible moment came back again, and suddenly he wanted nothing more than to step out of the forest into the full light of day. A dramatic change had come over him and over the woodland. The hunter was the same man, the trees the same trees, yet everything was somehow different. The broad oaks and beeches, the grey hornbeams, the tall stately ash trees were now seen by the hunter in greater detail. He was aware, without close study, of every knot and whirl in their trunks and every twist of their boughs. The very course of their sap was interesting. He found himself admiring their shapes and lines. The firs and the pines, laden with heavy snow, had all looked the same before. Now they were like individual people to him, all quite different. Yet there was something frightening about those sudden changes and new ways of looking at things. This fear made the hands holding his rifle tremble. Things. He had a new insight into nature's secrets, yet with this power had come a strange dread. He wondered if it had anything to do with the shooting the badger earlier in the day. He had always taken such opportunities when they presented themselves. He had killed such creatures by instinct. The badger had died because it was a wild animal, and the hunter was an excellent shot. It was as simple as that, nothing more. When he stepped into the clearing and felt the breeze on his face, the hunter felt himself relax. Switching on the safety catch of his rifle, he slung the weapon back onto his shoulder. Then he surveyed his surroundings and found himself pleasantly surprised, if not amazed. Before him stretched a broad lake, frozen silver in the weak evening sun, and patches of reed tucked away in the shallows. Around the lake was grassland, sparkling with frost where it poked through the thin layer of snow. Enclosing the meadows and lake was a woodland in which he had been hunting that day, with its oaks and elms, its pines and firs. It was what he saw on the far side of the lake that astonished him. However, for on that shore stood a magnificent building, a low rambling timber lodge, covering some 4 or 5 acres. It rose out of the snow, covered grassland as though it had grown from the landscape. The hunter took his binoculars out of their fur pouch and wiped the misted lenses. Then he studied this strange dwelling. From various points on the thatched roof of the massive lodge sprang tall, twisted red brick chimney stacks, smoking lazily into the evening sky. The hunter could see narrow windows of leaded glass, dozens of them, scattered along the walls of the lodge, 2/3 from the east end, though it was difficult to make out where the corners were. Stood 2 great arched double doors with decorative hinges of solid brass. Snow-decked ivy curled about the wavering eaves and dipped and ran with wooden gutters and dropped down into rain barrels at various unlikely intervals. The hunter, who was fond of the wooden building, thought the lodge magnificent. In presence in his setting took his breath away, and he found himself hoping it was some kind of hotel or inn of which he could spend the night. Better than bivouacking in the woods, he muttered to himself, for that was what he would otherwise have had to do. Too cold for that thing this time of year. The hunter made his way around the west shore of the lake, not daring to trust the ice to hold his weight. He passed some holes in the ice on the near side up to the dwelling, as if someone had been fishing. Finally, he came upon the massive double doors, an entrance to the great lodge. Above the doorway, a simple sign in German burned into a slab of oak, read Jagger Hall. Hunter's Hall, he said to himself. Perhaps it is a place to spend the night. He opened one of the doors and entered. If the magnificent exterior of the lodge had not astounded him, certainly the scene within would have done. The whole lodge seemed to consist of a single enormous room, with stone hearths scattered over the wooden floors. The light from the narrow windows did not reach far into the vast room, but made shafts of dying sunlight around the edge. Even through the log fires and lamps lit the centre, it was difficult for the hunter to see the far side. The atmosphere was thick with the scent of pine planks and wood smoke, human sweat and animal skins, mead, ale, and cooking meat. "Wonderful," whispered the hunter. Around the blazing hearth sat crowds of men and with sprinkling of women. All were dressed in hunting gear, but many of the outfits were old-fashioned, and some of them appeared to date from hundreds of years ago. There were plain green breechclouts, cracked leather jackets shiny with use, fur mittens and gloves. There were deerstalker hats, rough tweed coats, high calfskin boots. There were wax-skin waterproofs with many pockets, thick winter shirts and camouflage overalls, such as the hunter himself was wearing. Those sitting or sprawling around the fires were either talking in low voices or cleaning and polishing their weapons, or both. And such weapons! Guns and bows and spears and all manner of hunting tools. And the guns were not only modern high-powered rifles or shotguns, but barrel-loading flintlocks, single-shot breech loaders, and various other old-fashioned firearms. At the feet of many of the room's occupants sat gun and hunting dogs of all descriptions, from retrievers to Springer Spaniels to pointers to Irish setters. Like most hunting hounds, they were as quiet and docile indoors as they were active and sharp outdoors. In the centre of the great lodge was the largest of the fires, and hanging from the chain over its flames was the biggest cauldron the hunter had ever seen. It was from this huge iron pot that the wonderful odour of cooking meat and potatoes was issuing forth and filling the room. The hunter stood for a while, taking in the scene, which affected him to his very soul. It was the kind of place a weekend hunter dreams of while he's at work at his job in the city, or travels on a jet to a meeting with people he has no time for outside business dealings. This was clearly a gathering of huntsmen like himself, in the perfect setting. Feeling a little humble, the hunter walked across to the nearest fire and spoke to the man sitting there, cleaning a long old-fashioned rifle. "Excuse me, sir, may I sit by you?" The man answered him, but in French, which he did not understand at all. The hunter walked away from him, feeling bewildered. However, a second man on the other side of the hearth called to him, "Sit by me. I speak your language. We can talk together about tomorrow's tracking or today's successes. We can discuss the Christmas Day feast and the New Year hunt. We can speak about the law of the forest and the run of the game." Now this was the kind of conversation in which a hunter loved to participate. Gratefully he crossed the hearth and took the place indicated by the speaker, sitting on a deerskin close to the burning logs. The man was large, with a pleasant moon-shaped face, and the skin the colour of weathered mahogany. His black hair was long and hanging over the collar of his leather jacket, and his eyes were deep brown and clear. At the man's feet lay a black Labrador retriever staring into the flames. In his hands the man held a breech-loading rifle, the barrel of which he was subjecting to a vigorous pulling through of a cleaning cloth. He offered the hunter a look down the barrel at the shining spirals of rifling as the other sat down beside him. "Good," said the hunter, "not a spot of rust." "As it should be," said the man in a satisfied tone. The hunter pointed to the retriever, who was now watching him with the movement of the eyes only. "Fine water dogs those," he said. The man patted the dog on the head and received a lick on the hand as an acknowledgement. Yes, wonderful beasts. This one's been with me for a long time now, haven't you, old girl? She doesn't like the winter months, though. Not enough for her to do. The dog nuzzled his hand. What is this place? The hunter asked, gesturing with a sweep of his hand around the lodge. Who are these people? Is this some sort of Christmas Eve gathering? The man raised his eyebrows and looked a little sad. Ah, you are new. Then you may be in for a little shock. I think, unless you've guessed already. Guessed what? Asked the hunter, who hated puzzles. These people, as you call them, were all great hunters, or huntsmen, or huntresses, when they were alive, as you must have been yourself, for here you are in Jaegerhale. The place we are in is, of course, the lodge where we now reside, sleeping around our fires, preparing for the next day's hunt. The hunter smiled. You're making fun of me, he said. The man stared at him with serious eyes. No, I do not joke. You are dead, my friend, and in the hall of the great hunters. Do no one here can remember what they were called in life? Do you have a name? The man then concentrated on cleaning his gun, seemingly allowing the hunter time to think about what he had said. The hunter tried desperately to recall his own name. How could he ever forget such a thing? Yet there was nothing there, not even a hint of who he was or what he was called. His mind remained a complete blank on that point. He knew what he was, but not who he was, nor who his parents were. All he got from searching of his memory was a feeling of frustration. Wait a minute, he thought triumphantly. I can feel my own heart beating in my chest. Or was that an illusion? Was he breathing or simply going through the motions of breathing? Surely he was being made fun of, the object of hunters' humour, an initiation ceremony on the first entering of the lodge. Yet there were no others within earshot to enjoy the joke, only his dark-haired companion, intent on servicing his rifle. The man was looking at him again with quizzical eyes. What, said the dark-haired man, is the last thing you remember before the sky darkened and stillness came? The question shocked the hunter dreadfully. It meant the man knew about the incident in the forest. How could that be when the man had not been there? Perhaps the man had been hiding behind a tree. Surely he would have come to the hunter's assistance if he had. And in any case, something had happened inside the hunter as well as the outside. What do I remember? He repeated, and received a nod from his companion. What did he remember? Why, he and his friends had been tracking a stag, an animal with magnificent antlers. His first shot had struck the beast in the flank, wounding but not crippling. The stag had run, of course, a ragged route through the trees, and the hunters had followed the trail of blood, and then the tracks in the snow when the blood had dried on the wound. Then what? There was a sort of dark area in his memory after that, between the tracking the stag and the moment when the sky closed and fell silent. It was as if his mind was a shade in which a memory wouldn't come out, so he had to concentrate, to try to understand its shape. Though in an attempt to remain, he focused intently on that dark area, the memory began to emerge. Gradually, the reason it had remained hidden was because it was harrowing and that the hunter had subconsciously thrust it away, not wanting to remember something so appalling. Yet here it came out of the murk. Why, yes, he had been standing between two pines when a stag appeared again to his left. He recalled trying to swing the rifle round, but the strap had caught on something, a branch or a bush, hampering his aim. Then the stag had come on at speed, its eyes lowered in charge. Someone else, one of the others, had aimed and fired. A sudden flush of fear. Terrible pain, blood coming out of his chest and mouth in gouts, and then the darkening, the silence. These were his last memories. Dead, he thought. Am I dead? The thought must have shone in his eyes, for the other man said, I'm sorry. I'm still not convinced, said the hunter, but I'll go along with it for now. His new acquaintance shrugged. The hunter then started around the lodge at the other hunters. Indeed, they were a strange mixture of men and women, the majority of them with the appearance of being from the past. The hall of the hunters, how wonderful if it were. He spoke to the other man again. What happens then to us, dead? What happens, the man said broadly. Why, what happens is you hunt. The lake outside is stocked with every kind of fish, carp, salmon, trout, even minnow. The forest around the lodge has wild boar, deer, hares. You see that woman over there? He pointed to a slim huntress who was waxing a string of her bow. She can hit a hare on the run, pinning it to the earth with a single arrow. Pheasants, quail, wildfowl, every description, you name it, it's here. Yes, the hunting here is good, the best, and everything we kill during the day goes into that pot, you see, making the best stew you ever tasted. Here of an evening, in the great lodge, we feast, we eat, we drink, we enjoy our stories, and the next day, why, it all happens all over again. Those creatures we killed the day before rise again out of the woodland mosses, and out of the lake mud, and out of the bark of the trees. I have shot the same boar 7 times now, and still he runs the forest tracks. Tomorrow, of course, is the greatest banquet of the whole year, the Christmas Day feast. If this is death, thought the hunter, it is better than life. Is this heaven? He asked his companion. I should say so, though it can be hell too. Hell? That sounded ugly. But the hunter was not curious enough at that moment to ask about the dark side of death. He was content only to bask in the comradeship of the fellow hunters and enjoy what he had been his reward. The hall of the hunters, how he had dreamed of such a place. If that is so, he asked the man, where are the really great hunters of the world? For instance, I see no pygmies here. Where are the Effie or the Zaire? Where are those small dark hunters who excite their hunting dogs with cries and songs to flush out the quarry? Where are those renowned little archers? The man shrugged, a gesture which seemed typical of him. There are a few hunters from other parts of the world here in this lodge, but mostly they prefer their own type of hunting grounds, the ones they were used to in life. Those 2 men over there are our Australian Aboriginals, and in the far corner behind the great hearth you will see a group of Iban Indians. There are others. We join together for feasts from time to time and try each other's hunting grounds. There are great hunts in which we all become involved together. And afterwards we exchange stories and talk about our different skills. Here in Hunters Hall, you will see mainly those, those who have been touched by the mysticism and legends of our own land, by beliefs of our forefathers, those who hunted in the brush during life, or in the jungle, or across the snowy tundra. Usually want the same landscapes after death. The Inuit do not want to hunt in our forest all the time, neither do we prefer the icy wastes, but there is nothing to stop you doing so if you wish. You can hunt in any landscape you like, or in the sea. It is your choice. I think I understand. There was a silence between them now. All that could be heard was the murmuring around the room, as hunters told hunters their tales of the hunt. It was their one source of entertainment for the long, lazy evening hours. When the dying sun shone through the tall windows into the dimness of the great room, the hunter breathed the scent of burning hickory and sighed in contentment. The dark-haired man then engaged his best attention once more. "Tell me," said the man, "the best hunt you ever had in your life." The best hunt? A surge of excitement went through the hunter's breast. Oh yes, the very best of hunts. But could he tell this man about that time on so short an acquaintance? He decided he could not. Instead, he recounted the time he had tracked and killed the wolves. They were the last wolves left in Scandinavia, an old pair, but still very dangerous and tricky. They threw me off the trail several times, I can tell you. I tracked them over the snow and shot them outside a cave. The whole thing took many weeks. It was a great experience. A frown appeared on the brow of the other man. He said, "Did you not eat the flesh? Or did you need the pelts to keep you from dying of the cold? Or perhaps the wolves attacked and killed a child?" The hunter, puzzled by his companion's questions, shook his head vigorously. "No, none of those. You don't understand. I killed them for sport, for the thrill of the hunt." "Then," said the man, "I cannot understand why you are here in this lodge. Here we have only huntsmen who killed out of necessity, or to protect themselves or their families. This is the mark of a true hunter, the real hunter, who kills to feed or clothe himself, but not simply to see blood." For a moment, the dark-haired man's words stunned him, but then the hunter shrugged and said, "I am here." Suddenly, he had a great desire to shock this man, to whom he was beginning to take a dislike. He decided to tell his self-righteousness companion the story of the greatest of all hunts, the greatest of all prey, which he himself had once hunted. If the dark-haired man did not like it, there were others to talk to in this room. "I once stalked the most cunning creature on this planet," said the hunter. "I pursued him, tracked him, and killed him where he stood. Never has anything equaled the moment when I squeezed the trigger and saw him jerk backwards to lie in the dust. A bullet from this very rifle, in this heart." The man stroked his dog, not looking at the hunter now, and asked, "What quarry would that be?" "A man," said the hunter. Now the brown eyes flickered to his face, and he felt satisfaction. knowing he had disturbed the owner of those eyes. Yes, he told the other, a manhunt. One night we captured. It doesn't matter who or what he was, except that he was a human being, a man. We let him go into the wood, then we went after him. It was my shot that killed him. There was a long silence between them, until finally the man stopped stroking his dog and looked up. His eyes were full of sorrow and pity. You killed a fellow creature, he said, one of your own kind for sport. Now I understand why you are here. This will be your only night in this lodge, to give you an opportunity to witness and experience what you might have had, what you have thrown away. Tomorrow, you go into the forest. The hunter felt a certain fear at the other man's words, but he added quickly, as you will go yourself. But I go as a hunter, said the man. You will be the prey. The newest hunter felt a bolt of terror go through him at these words and looked around him, his mind in turmoil. He glanced at the other hunters cleaning their weapons, at the soft rugs on which he would sleep that night, and finally his eyes rested on the cauldron, the great stew that would be eaten before retiring. A feeling of faint triumph trickled through his mind, bringing with it hope. Something was wrong with the logic of his fireside companion. There were surely errors in the rules, the laws of this place. Perhaps the dead told lies, and the truth was still to be revealed. Maybe the mistake was not yet his. Possibly these things were not set in stone, but could be changed by clever argument. He would not accept what had been said to him without further dispute. Ah, he said to his disapproving companion, but there's something wrong here. You told me a moment ago that what true hunter kills must be eaten. That means if I am to be the prey and you kill me, you must eat me. Are you then cannibals? Even if I am changed into a beast to be hunted and killed over and over again for all eternity, I am still in my soul a man. I may not keep a man's body, but I will always have his spirit, which can't be altered because it is me. Do you hunters, you great hunters, eat the flesh of your fellow men? Do you gnaw the bones of your comrades? Do you drink the blood of your own kind? Are you then going to hunt and kill me, then eat me? The black-haired man looked deep into his eyes. No, of course we won't eat you, but we have to feed our dogs. How was that? Hunter's Hall by Gary Kilworth. Wasn't that nice and scary, darlings? Do you like another? The Crossing by Joe Boyle from 1992. Mysterious Christmas Tales. Sean Connery had never been to Fleetwood, even though his grandparents had lived there all their lives. and his own father had grown up there for the first 15 years of his life. Sean himself had never set foot in the place. If I tell you that Sean Michael Connery lived at number 15 Brownlow Hill, Douglas, Isle of Man, you may realise that we're not talking about the film star of that name, not the James Bond of the late 60s and early 70s. True, he had been named after the famous man, because Connery, the star, had been a hero of his father, David, but there any similarity ended. For our Sean Connery liked nothing better than a simple life, and asked nothing more in general than to be left in peace with a good book. Sean's father was a photographer, and his mother a travel writer, and Sean had done his fair share of travelling in his 15 years, accompanying his parents on their work trips, usually somewhere in Europe. As he got older, he joined them for weekends and school holidays, and lived with the housekeeper Anna whenever his parents were away in term time. It had been a lonely life, but Sean had grown used to being on his own and was quite capable of amusing himself. In fact, he actually preferred his own company to the company of other people, which was why, once again, he was not looking forward to Christmas. His mother and father had been in Windermere for the past 2 weeks, helping to compile a booklet for the Lake District and the Lakelands Tourist Board. And since Christmas fell right at the end of their 2-week stint, they had decided to stay on for all the festivities. Well, as Sean knew, his dad would have decided, and as usual his mum would have had to agree. Sylvia Connery never got any choice in these matters, and had learned long ago that her husband always got what he wanted, at any cost. The instructions Sean had received from his father over the phone had been quite clear. He had to catch the 8 o'clock evening sailing from Douglas to Heysham that night, to be met by his parents and taken back to Windermere for the festive period. There had been no point in protesting. The tone of his father's voice, as usual, had left no room for that, and Sean had hung up feeling quite depressed and made for his bedroom to organise his packing. It was going to be another over-the-top Christmas. Sean had always envied the thousands of families who spent the festive season in an orderly, civilised manner, with presents around the trees, church service, a turkey dinner, and carols and the like. Christmas in Windermere, though a little isolated, threatened to be like every other Christmas he could remember, no different from Christmas in Munich, or Christmas in Madrid, or Oslo, or Lisbon, all of which had been vulgar, loud, brash, drunken, and unbearable. Last year's Christmas had been in Amsterdam, and his father had brought every inhabitant of every club into the city and back to their rented apartment, or so it had seemed. The Christmas Eve party had gone on until midday on Christmas morning, with Sean being shown off like a prize exhibit into the small hours. It was one thing being someone your father could be proud of, but quite another to feel owned. And his father did treat him like a possession, something to be taken out and dusted off and held up for everyone to see. "My son," David would proclaim loudly. "This is my son, Sean Connery." Then someone was bound to mimic. "The name's Bond, James Bond, and Sean would squirm with embarrassment and feel like hiding from the noise and the din of the humiliation. That was when he would remember the reason for his father's Christmas excess. His mum would persuade him to go along with it all, reminding him of what had happened all those years ago and why David Connery had to surround himself with noise, music and people at this time of year. Sean took a shoebox from under his bed, and from it he extracted an old photograph, one he had found behind a mirror in the attic a few years ago. It was of a young couple pushing an infant in a pram along a seafront promenade, and in the background was a lighthouse. It was a photograph he treasured, the only one that existed of his grandparents. The infant in the pram was his father. It said so on the back. 20 years ago, at Christmas time, a fire had raged through the tiny terrace house in Fleetwood, Lancashire, where David and his parents had lived. The fire officer had said that the malfunction of the lights and the Christmas tree had started it, but by the time it had burned itself out, David's parents, Sean's grandparents, had been burned to death. David himself had survived unhurt, but as 15-year-old orphan, had eventually been sent to live with an aunt in Douglas. He never spoke of the incident. Neither would he ever speak of his parents or his childhood. His way of coping with the memory of that awful night was to hide himself behind a forced joviality on the anniversary of it every year. Sean propped the photograph on his desk and prepared to go off to the shops to purchase presents for his family. Simple items as usual, but ones he made sure he'd given thought to, in complete contrast to the gifts Sean's father showered him on him every year. Bags of them, all shop wrapped, all things he didn't need and didn't want. Piles of items he knew his father had simply pointed to and paid for to be delivered. At the risk of sounding ungrateful, they meant nothing to Sean. He would rather have had one small gift, chosen with love, than all the others put together. It was almost as though his father was trying to make up for something. But what? All the years of leaving him on his own? Hardly. Sean was born a loner anyway. Everybody knew that. There was never a flood of presents on his birthday, only at Christmas. What was his father trying to prove? It was something that Sean had thought about long and hard on more than one occasion. The plain fact was that David Connery lived for his son. Some would say lived through him, and Sean was painfully aware of it. He was aware also, of course, of how much he was cared for. Loved wasn't a word easily associated with his father, but for all that, the annual shower of gifts was meaningless, and for some years already, Sean had been giving most of the presents away to the Society for the Needy Children, without his father even noticing they had gone. The stores were thronged with people, and there was a Christmas buzz in the air, which Sean found he couldn't quite tune into. There wasn't much point. His Christmas was destined to be spent miles away from here, with strangers. He brought the porcelain ballerina figure he knew Anna wanted, and the antique brooch he'd reserved for his mum, and the compilation of Ian Fleming stories he'd ordered for his father was awaiting collection. So, armed with sufficient wrapping paper, he headed back home. There would just be enough time to wrap them, give Anna hers, have tea, then make for the ferry terminal. Dusk was falling as he got back into his bedroom, and he switched on the lights of his own miniature tree and drew the curtains. He glanced often at the photograph on his desk, whilst he wrapped the gifts. What kind of people had his grandparents been? What was it about his father that made him want to erase their memory completely? There was something more to it than that. That they had died in an accident, Sean was certain. What had happened that Christmas 20 years ago? He sat and looked at the photograph in his hand, studying the obscure faces, imagining what it might have been like to know them, savouring their stillness and the quiet which he knew could never be a part of any Christmas for him. The taxi dropped him at the ferry terminal in good time for boarding. The presents he'd bought nestled in a holdall as he crunched his way to the department lounge, his breath forming in quick clouds before his face in the cold night air. In the departure area, he found his fellow passengers were a few indeed. There were mostly couples of varying ages, one or two families with children, but nobody his age at all. Not many people left the island at this time of year, but most of those who did flew to the mainland cities. He would have flown himself had there been an airport near Windermere. The boats had certainly done better business when they had sailed into Fleetwood, but with his crossing now terminated, the Morecambe Bay port of Heysham was the only stopping off point out of season. Sean knew all the boats and was happy to see that they were aboard the Snaefell. He knew her to have a good motion, dependable in rough weather. Not like the sea tonight was rough at all. It was a chilly night, and once aboard, most of the passengers lost no time in going below decks to the comfort of the dining area. Sean, however, felt restless, and after padding aimlessly around the inner lounges for a while, he decided to go up on deck, where the fresher air might clear his head. It was a clear, crisp night, with the forward motion of the ship adding a knife edge to the cold. Stars blinked out of a velvet black sky, and the North Star in particular gleamed like a distant jewel. What little moon there was cast a pale sweep of light over the surface of the water, picking out the churning wake of the vessel, which Sean could see as he stood on the stern, trailing out behind and into the distance, where it lay like a flat ribbon long after the boat had passed. The lights of Douglas could still be seen sparkling from afar, and to the left the beacon at Greswick Point, with Laxley over on his right-hand side. He was the only soul above decks, encapsulated in the moment of complete isolation, his senses hijacked by the dull rhythmic thud of the engines and the swish of the water, and the roistering smell that all ships have at their working end, a mixture of salt and diesel. He was totally unprepared for what happened next. Without warning, all sound cut out as effectively as if someone had closed the door. He could still hear the creaming wake, feel the thump and vibration of the engines, but for some accountable reason, no sound. He looked about him wildly, anxiety gnawing at his chest. Then, just as suddenly, from his right came a flash, if something that had lasted longer than an instant, as this did, could be called a flash. It was as though someone had swung a shiny sword in an arc, from his right over to his left, from horizon to horizon, and with it came a noise such as might be heard in a sawmill, that ringing, zinging whine as a revolving saw slices through wood, a sort of zzz. The whole thing lasted maybe 2 seconds before the hearing shot back into his head with such suddenness that he flinched. Once again the beat of the engines and the churn of the water resumed, though not quite as before. His first instincts told him that the pace had slowed, that the weight was less turbulent, the engine noise less thrusting. A less observant person would have settled for that. But Sean had stood and listened to enough engines on enough Irish sea crossings in his life to realise that there was something more to it than that. Unlikely as it might seem, it sounded almost as though he was listening to a different engine. His eyes followed the ship's wake, and what he saw at the end of it brought a puzzled frown to his brow. The lights of the now distant island, so visible a moment before, had disappeared. For what seemed to him a long time, but could only have been a couple of minutes, Sean stood, gripping the rail, trying to work out what had happened. Things felt different. He couldn't explain how, but even the smell was different from which he remembered before the interruption. He looked back down the boat. The decks were still deserted, and the funnel taller than he remembered. It was beginning to reflect the ever-increasing glow in the sky as dawn broke on the port side. Could he be imagining all of this? Perhaps he had the beginnings of a winter chill, a virus of some kind. His head had been muzzy before he came out here. But wait a minute. The dawn? How could that be possible? They had left the port on the 8 o'clock evening sailing. That could have been more than 20 minutes ago. And yet, he felt his scalp prickle with an apprehension. He could see now that beyond the prow of the boat there was land, and fairly near too. But how could that be? The crossing to Heysham was 3.5 hours, and a possibility registered. He must have blacked out. Yes, that must have been what happened. He looked at his watch and was startled to see that it was showing 6:30. A wave of sickness lurched over him that had nothing to do with sailing. He swallowed hard, picked up his holdall, and slowly walked towards midships. As they neared the shore, people began to emerge from below, obviously preparing to disembark. Sean eyed them warily. Where on earth were they all coming from? There could have been more than 50 passengers on board, yet suddenly here were crowds. And he didn't remember seeing any of them before. These people were of a different type, dressed differently, and in clothes which seemed strangely dated. There were many more families with children, and up by the bow he could see what looked like a school party of youngsters around his age, larking and pointed excitedly ahead. Fear knotted Sean's stomach. This must be a nightmare. He must be lying in bed dreaming all this, and any moment he'd wake up, or else, that was it, he'd made a genuine mistake and boarded the wrong boat. His hopes sank as quickly as it had risen. There was only one sailing, one destination, Heysham, and nowhere within 20 minutes sail of all that island. An object floated past on the starboard side. A pier. A pier? He stared at it. A Victorian pier with an amusement arcade at the end. There were men fishing off this one. Heysham didn't have a pier. Where exactly was he? And who were all these people? His eyes fell on a brass plate bolted to the back of the ship's bridge. It bore the name of the ship he was on, and read it quite distinctly, Lady of Man. He looked around more carefully, and the more he saw, the more he realized that this indeed was a ship, an older vessel altogether. They were now speeding up an estuary, and the town they were sailing into hove into view. There was a small beach, a lifeboat station, a tall inland lighthouse, vaguely familiar, set among the streets of terraced houses. The promenade bordering the beach was not 100 yards from the ship's side as they sped by, and Sean noticed a hotel, the North Euston. Then the ship was docking, its engines complaining as they were thrown into reverse to slow it to a stop beside the quay. Men in blue jerseys stood ready to throw ropes out to the others who waited on the quayside to secure them to the bollards, and the passengers crowded towards the spot where the gangplank would be set up. Jostling, shuffling, they surged forward, and Sean was caught up in the push to disembark, his heart thudding with alarm, his knees suddenly weak with disbelief. It was then that he saw the name in red letters on the white background of the place at which the Lady of Man had docked. The blood drained from his face as he read Fleetwood Docks and Harbour Board. He began to struggle, fighting not only against the tide of people, but against the idea of what was happening to him. Panic bubbled in his throat as he tried vainly to prevent himself being taken from the ship. A few of the passengers looked mildly surprised that he was facing the wrong way, but no one seemed to unduly concerned. "Watch what you're doing, young lad," said one man, but there was no threat in his voice, and the warning was obviously meant kindly. He had reached the lowered gangplank now, and once inside its restricted width, with a downward slope, it was useless to struggle. Quite suddenly, the throng emptied out into the quayside, and Sean was bustled and buffeted to the fringes of the crowd. He stood clutching his bag, panting with the effort, and watched as people streamed away in their groups, wishing each other a Merry Christmas and all the best for the new year. The school party went chattering past. Some of the girls looked at Sean and smiled, then giggled to each other as they troped off, arm in arm. One or two of the boys threw a "see ya" in his direction, but they'd gone before Sean even realized it was him they were speaking to. He was still standing motionless beneath the red and white sign as the last stragglers departed. Alone, the enormity of the situation began to descend on his shoulders like a big black vulture. He tried to think logically, sort out the chain of events which had landed him here. The facts were that he was in Fleetwood, but there had been no sailings from the Isle of Man to Fleetwood for the past, Lord knows how many years. He had just got off the boat. He hadn't boarded, and then logic deserted him. The one question his mind kept throwing up was, why? A figure was silhouetted against the sky at the top of the slipway. It was a woman, and he watched as she slowly made her way down to where he stood. There was something he recognized about her, the way she walked perhaps, as she approached, and her features became visible. The familiarity became even more marked. Something about her eyes reminded him of someone he knew. He judged her to be about 50, and she stopped a few meters from him, as though unwilling to approach nearer than that. Her hands clasped nervously across a coat that looked too thin for the cold. "David," she said timorously. Aren't you coming home? He stared at her open-mouthed. David, she repeated. He licked his dry lips and found his voice. I'm Sean, was all he could say. The woman gave him a thin, brief smile. It's warmer at home, she said. She made no attempt to touch him and just turned and walked a few steps and waited for him to follow. In a daze, not quite knowing why, he did so. The slipway led out onto a road lined on one side with a terrace of Edwardian houses. There was a public garden fronting the hotel he had seen, and in between the two ran a tram track which skirted the inland lighthouse. A couple of cream and green trams of a design which could have been called streamlined a few good years ago rattled past. Did you enjoy yourself? The woman asked. She was obviously under the impression that he was someone else, and Sean felt it was time to put things straight. I don't think I'm the person, he began. Then another tram rattled past and drowned what he had to say. She walked across the tram track, looking over her shoulder, and again he felt impelled to follow her. He caught up with her on the other side of the road, anxious now that he should state his case. Did you hear what I said? He almost shouted. A look of fear stole over her face, and Sean immediately regretted his tone of voice. My name's Sean, he said more softly. If you like, she said, and again the thin, brief smile, almost in pity. Your father might have a surprise for you when you get home, she continued, glancing nervously to see that he was following. My father, he muttered, stumbling hesitantly after her. We've been doing some thinking while you've been away, he said to me. He said Mother or David ought to have whatever he wants. Mother? David? His father? She thought she was his mother. It was then the familiarity he'd seen about her registered with a shock. Her eyes were exactly like his father's, the same light blue, the same shape. She thought he was David, his father. Then who was she? Surely not. Panic set in. He had to get away. Where to? The boat. He had come on a boat, and if he went back on it, maybe everything would sort itself out. Whatever happened, he couldn't go another step with this woman who thought he was her son. He ran. He didn't see the tram rounding the corner. His head hit it full side on, and he sank to the ground, blackness closing in. The bedroom Sean awoke in was tiny and cold. He struggled to the surface from the nightmare that had been and gone on too long. He found himself lying in bed with a bandage around his head. The curtains were drawn, but so thin that the light came through anyway, and the clock beside him, ticking ridiculously loudly, told him it was close to 2. The door opened. She placed a hot mug of something by the bedside and drew back the curtains. In this light, it was even more obvious that they were closely related. But Sean's mind still couldn't accept what all the evidence so far seemed to suggest. What's going on? He asked. You bumped your head. They would have kept you in hospital, but with it being Christmas. That wasn't what he wanted to know, he remembered the tram car well enough. Drink your drink, David. He wanted to scream at her. I'm not David. I'm not your son. David is my father. But the futility of doing so penetrated even the ache in his head. His real feelings must have shone on his face, because the look of fear came into her eyes again, and she took a step backwards. There was no doubt she was frightened of him. He had seen a similar reaction from his own mother on the occasions that his father lost his temper. It had always disturbed him. He reached over and took the blackcurrant drink. "I've got some last-minute shopping to do," she said timidly, "but your father will be in by tea time." Sean nodded, too bewildered to argue. She fussed around a little longer, then left quietly, being careful to close the door with the tiniest of clicks. Sean stared around, and what he saw increased his bewilderment. Everything about the room suggested that it had been kept that way, and it might have been that way 20 years ago, but from the floral wallpaper and the candlewick bedspread to the flimsy wood grain effect chest of drawers. But it was what he saw on the walls that alarmed him. There were pictures of Sean Connery everywhere, posters of the early Bond films, action shots, Bond's weapons, his gadget, his cars, his girlfriends. There was also racing cars of the time, sleek enough then, but oddly out of date by today's standards. There was a magazine cutting of an expensive camera that Sean recognised as a Hasselblad 500 cm, the best that money could buy, and respected by top photographers. Even today, his father had the latest model. Why would anyone want to keep a room 20 years out of date? And how come all the cuttings look new? Surely they would have yellowed with age. It was then he saw the poster on the wall above his bed that his stomach sank. It was of Manchester United, his father's favourite team, but his lineup included such players as Charlton, Best and Law. And there at the bottom left-hand corner was the year of the season, 1972-1973. He sank back on the pillow. This room hadn't been just kept like this. It was like this, like the people on the boat, the tram cars, everything. It was real. It was 1973, and this was his father's room. The woman, his grandmother, and he somehow had taken place of his father. Then another terrible thought struck him. It was also Christmas, and he remembered that what had happened in this tiny terraced house in Fleetwood at Christmas time 20 years ago. He put his hands over his face and moaned despairingly through his fingers. The stairs led down into the only living room, of which was a tiny kitchen, and Sean stepped into a room. A cat curled by a meagre fire awoke and saw him. Fear and alarm showed clearly in its eyes as it shot from the room, growling. The furniture was cheap and shabby but clean, and a piece of cardboard covered a broken pane in the window. Over on the sideboard stood a framed picture of his father as a youth, the sort taken by school photographers. There. Sean's despair had been replaced by desperate inquisitiveness. He reasoned that he had been brought here for a specific reason. No matter how it had happened, the important thing was that he was here, in this house, at this particular time. And given that it was the time that his grandparents had perished, it stood to reason, as far as he was concerned, that he was here to witness the tragedy. But why? The fire, he remembered, had been started by faulty tree lights. The tree, a dry spruce, stood in the corner, and he could see how easily it might catch a light. But though it was bedecked with a variety of baubles, there were no lights on it. A draught of cold air accompanied at the opening of the front door, and a tall girl, about 18, entered, her face unsmiling. Her manner was no more friendly, as he was about to discover. "Back, are you?" she jibed. Pity. She dug her hands in her pockets and glared at him. Saw Auntie Mary down the shops. Said you've been headbutting trams. Mary, his grandmother's name. If she was a girl's aunt, this was his cousin, or rather his father's cousin. It's just a bruise, he stammered. Like I said, pity. She wagged a finger in his face. I've just come to warn you, David. Warn me? Yes, warn you. Your mum and dad have been worried sick about getting you that rotten camera. What camera? Don't play innocent with me. You know what camera. Your dad's pawned damn near all he's got to buy it, and I still don't think he's got enough. He remembered the cutting in the bedroom. He's not trying to buy a Hasselblad. They can't afford one of them. She towered above him, shouting, A bit late now. You were screaming blue murder for one before you went on school trip to the Isle, Anne. That was a week ago. And they still can't afford to repair yon window you smashed in your temper. I did that, he murmured. Well, I didn't, but then again, I'm not as spiteful as you. You really will do anything to get what you want, won't you? Sean felt tears pricking his eyes. The picture his cousin was painting was of his father, and much of what she said had parallels with what he knew of him. At times he did bully, and Sean's mother was the main victim. He could be frightening in his temper, and yes, Sean had to admit his father had an underlying violent nature. It hurt to think that this was the way he had treated his own parents. The girl scowled menacingly. So I'm warning you, toe rag. If Auntie Mary and Uncle Graham haven't been able to get you that poxy camera, just don't take it out, and then, all right. She stepped to the door, then turned. You spoil their Christmas, and you'll have more than a bruised head. You hear me? With that, she yanked open the door and was gone. Sean sank into the worn armchair, incredibly saddened, and in no more than a minute was asleep. The clink of plates awoke him. His grandmother was laying the table, and sitting at it facing him was a man he recognised at once, though they'd never met. He was simply an older version of Sean's own father, though the eyes that looked at him now were kinder and more gentle. How are you, son? He said. Been in the wars? I'm fine, said Sean. Thanks. It must have been the thanks, for the look of surprise passed between Graham Connery and his wife. The tea was plain but tasty, and Sean was touched by the genuine affection the couple showed for him, though he sensed that their manner was hesitant. For his part, he tried as much as he could to make them feel that they meant something to him. They were, after all, the grandparents he'd never known, and he owed them the respect, courtesy, and love that seemed they'd never got from their own son. Gradually, the tension that had been there at the start of the meal eased, and they relaxed and began to smile. Sean felt he was meeting old friends after a long time apart, and as they talked and laughed into the evening, he became aware that these two people whom he loved and who loved him. The thought of what had to take place tormented him, and as the evening wore on, he began to think of ways in which he could prevent it happening. Around 9 o'clock, his grandmother laid her hand on his. You're a different lad, David, she smiled. Whether it's a knock on the head or what, I don't know, but yes, a different lad. And the tears brimmed in her eyes. Look, said Sean, about the camera. They looked anxious again. Did you get one? The silence and their shared glances told their own story. Good, Sean went on, because I don't want one. But it's not important. Are you sure? Sean nodded. What is important, he said, is that you both know something. They were puzzled, wary, intrigued. There was a hint of the old anxiety and tension. "I want you both to know that I love you." In the silence that followed, the wind rumbled in the chimney. Then spontaneously the three stood and hugged each other, tears flowing freely. "Put kettle on, Mother. I've a bit of a surprise." Graham Connery disentangled himself, self-consciously wiped a tear and dived a hand into a brown paper bag by the door. Sean shuddered as his grandfather produced a cheap kit of Christmas tree lights. His shout made his grandmother jump. "No!" Lights for the tree! He was confused by Sean's reaction. Sean backpedaled. If he made the scene now, it could only destroy the love and trust they'd built between them these last 3 hours. He tried to speak calmly. We don't need them. The tree's nice enough." "But this'll make it a real Christmas tree. What do you say, Mother?" "If David doesn't want them on," she began. I don't," cut in Sean. His grandfather hesitated. Then a twinkle came to his eye. "Well, for once, David Michael Connery, I'm going to do what I want." Sean watched helplessly as the lights were threaded around the dry, brittle branches and ceremoniously plugged into the socket. Was this how it had been? Was this the start of the torment he would have to witness? Soon afterwards, his grandmother suggested an early night might do them some good, especially in view of the episode with the tram, and Sean found himself an unwilling player in the drama he knew that was about to unfold. In a short time the tree lights would malfunction and the house would blaze from top to bottom. But what if he were to unplug the lights? Did the fire have to take place? What would happen if he didn't? His father or him would go on living in the house. The move to Douglas would never take place, and his father never met and marry his mother. He, Sean, would never be born. But could he let 2 people die horribly in a fire just so that could happen? Must unplug the lights. Sean snapped back to reality as his grandfather spoke. "Saw it in the paper, danger them are if you leave the plug in overnight." He leaned down and removed the plug, and the lights snuffed out. "Good night, son. Merry Christmas." I'll stay up a bit and read," said Sean. He had to think this through. "Reading now, is it?" said grandmother, and shook her head. Different lad altogether. Would she have ever known how right she was? He kissed and hugged them, hope rising that there was a chance after all that the fire could be prevented, and watched as they made their way upstairs. Sean sat and thought, and the more he thought, the more confused he became. If he was witnessing what had actually taken place on the night of the fire, how could the fire have started? He had seen his grandfather unplug the lights. Sean remembered the look of fear in his grandmother's eyes when they first met, and how she had avoided coming too near him. He heard again the accusations of the cousin, of how his father always got his own way, no matter what. The wind whistled in the broken pane, reminding him of how it came to be broken. Did his father know more about the cause of the tragedy than he cared to admit? Was the real reason why, every Christmas since he'd had to drown out the memory of it, senseless revelry, were all the presents he gave away of soothing his consciousness? Sean dismissed the thoughts from his mind. The conclusion was too terrible to contemplate. Instead, he sat about in the task of making sure that, if at all possible, the fire should not take place. He stretched the cable of the lights as far away from the socket as possible, and sat down to watch the tree, all night if need be. At 3 a.m, his eyes grew heavy, and by 1:15 he was dropping. He sat up sharply, Something had woken him. But what? Unbelievably, the tree lights were twinkling, scattered shadows over the wall and the ceiling, and the plug he had trailed over to the far side of the room was there, firmly in the socket. Instinctively, Sean tried to move towards it, only to find that a chair he was in held him as tightly as if he had been sewn into it. Helplessly, he could only watch as, with an incredible slowness, the tree began to topple, and yet as it fell, it didn't pick up speed, didn't fall with a crash. It was almost as though it was being lowered to the ground by unseen hands. The tree twitched and jerked as if it would, moved around until the topmost branch sought and found the middle of the embers of the fire in the grate. A flame ran hungrily along the thin trunk, spreading rapidly out into the branches, which spat and crackled as they caught alight. Sean, powerless to move, could only watch mesmerized as the tree righted itself, shedding baubles as it did so, leaving an arc of smoke as it swung back into position. It was then that Sean saw the figure of a boy crouched at the foot of a burning tree. Only when he caught sight of the boy's face could he allow himself to believe the unacceptably, numbly, as he watched the image of his own father straighten up and cross to the front door. The flames flared, fed by a blast of cold air. Behind him, the front door opened, then closed. On the same instant, the paralysis which had held Sean to his seat evaporated, and he leapt to his feet. The tree was now blazing, already the flames spreading along the floor. Dense smoke billowed from a foam-backed carpet, choking him, preventing him from shouting a warning up the stairs. Then paint on the woodwork reached flashpoint and erupted into flame. He had difficulty in seeing, his eyes smarting from the acrid fumes. And then suddenly a wall of flames sprang up between him and the stairs. The fire brigade, he had to get them. It was his grandparents' only hope. He turned and dashed into the street, screaming for help at the top of his voice. People came running, ladders were called for, and not one but a dozen neighbours phoned the fire brigade. There were shouts, screams and thudding, and feet at the windows burst outwards with the heat. Sean witnessed it all in a haze of horror. Then it was as though everyone and everything around him, all sound and motion, faded into the background. He could see the commotion of the periphery of his vision, heard the shouts and screams at the edges of his hearing, but as he looked into the flames, he saw not a burning house, but a promenade with a lighthouse in the background, and walking towards him were a young couple pushing a pram. The pram was empty. They stopped, framed in the burning doorway, which to Sean's eyes wasn't burning at all, and they beckoned to him, smiling. Sean suddenly felt an irresistible urge to be with them. Sylvia and David Connery had waited at the ferry port in Heysham long after the last of the few passengers on the Snaefell had disembarked. A check with the ferrymaster confirmed that Sean's name was not on the passenger list, and David had begun to get angry. He's missed the boat, the young tyke. They had tried several times to phone the house, only to find that the line was unobtainable. It was while they were waiting in the cafeteria, debating what to do next, that the policeman came with the message. The housekeeper, Anna, had alerted them, and the officer had some bad news. Sean had died following a fire in his bedroom. Apparently, the lights on his Christmas tree had malfunctioned. Wasn't that scary, my darlings? Now, I will have to leave you, my lovelies, as I am running out of power on my phone. Thank you very much for tuning in for the very scary ghost stories. I hope you have a wonderful Christmas. If I don't see you this side of Christmas, I hope you have the most wonderful time. Happy Christmas, my darlings. All my love, as always. Your fairy. Your darling fairy. Bye-bye, my darlings. Have a wonderful Christmas. I shall see you another time. Bye-bye.